In the spring of 1890, a woman named Adele, recorded in the account books of a Royal Street household in New Orleans only by that single name, was asked to clear and clean the upper storage rooms of the townhouse where she had been employed for 11 months. The rooms had been shuttered since approximately 1872, when the previous generation of the owning family had consolidated the household downstairs following a death and a period of reduced means. Among the objects Adele uncovered in those rooms was a mirror, roughly 4 feet by 2.5, in a carved and gilded frame, covered with a canvas cloth that had been secured with cord to the frame's upper hooks in a manner suggesting deliberate, careful covering rather than mere storage. She removed the cloth. She cleaned the glass with damp linen as she would have cleaned any other mirror. She worked on it for the better part of a morning because the glass was badly clouded and the backing, visible at the mirror's edges, had deteriorated into dark patches and silver-gray crystals that required careful wiping. Within 3 days she was ill. Within a week she was dead. The death certificate issued by the attending physician lists the cause as acute catarrhal fever. It is a diagnosis that, in New Orleans in 1890, could mean almost anything, and in this case, I believe, was selected because it meant nothing in particular at all. I found Adele through a physician's journal, which is not where I expected to find her. I had been researching the household records of French Creole estates in New Orleans between 1880 and 1910, tracking the dispersal of colonial period objects, furniture, silver, documents, as the old families sold off assets under the economic pressures of that decade. The Tulane University Special Collections holds a number of personal journals donated by families with ties to the 19th century medical community. And in one of them, the private journal of a physician I will call Dr. E.B., because his full name is identifiable from the journal's accession record and his descendants are living, I found a notation dated April 1890 that did not match the death certificate I had already located for Adele. The certificate says fever. The journal says something else entirely. It says tremors in the extremities beginning on the 2nd day, excessive salivation, and a reported metallic taste. Progressive weakness in the hands and forearms, and on the 5th day a respiratory crisis from which she did not recover. Dr. E.B. wrote, in a notation that occupies half a page rather than the usual 2 or 3 lines, that he had read accounts in the Gazette Médicale de Paris of mercury poisoning from the handling of antique mirrors, and that Adele's presentation was, in his assessment, fully consistent with such an exposure. He named the mirror. He noted where it was in the house. And then he wrote that the family had asked him, in his phrase, not to press the matter further, and that he had agreed to list the cause of death as fever because he did not have, in his own words, the evidence necessary to sustain a different conclusion in court. By the time we reach the end of this, you will understand what that mirror was, where it came from, and why the family had covered it carefully with canvas and cord sometime around 1820, decades before Adele came to clean it. I want to be honest with you about what I can establish and what I cannot. I cannot prove the mirror killed Adele. The death certificate says fever. The physician's private journal says mercury poisoning. And the physician himself declined to press the matter. What I can give you is a documented chain running from a colonial-era Haitian plantation inventory to a 1890 New Orleans household to a physician's private notation to a solicitor's letter that I want you to hear before we finish. That chain does not leave many innocent explanations standing. Mercury mirrors are something most people today do not know existed, and that gap in knowledge is part of what makes this story possible to hide. Before approximately 1835, virtually every mirror in the European and American world was made by applying a thin amalgam of mercury and tin to the back of a glass plate. The mercury gave the backing its reflective quality. It also made the mirror, over time, a slow-release chemical reservoir. Because mercury amalgam deteriorates, and as it deteriorates, it releases mercury vapor into the surrounding air. A sealed room. A badly deteriorated mirror. A woman cleaning it with damp cloth, agitating the deteriorated backing, working close to the glass for the better part of a morning. That is not a supernatural story. That is occupational poisoning. And it was not unknown to the people who worked with mirrors professionally. Mirror makers in France and Venice had been dying of mercury poisoning for 2 centuries. Their condition, known by the name erethism, characterized by tremor, excessive salivation, and neurological decline, documented extensively in European medical literature and formally described in French toxicological publications by the 1830s. The risk was understood in the manufacturing context. What was not widely understood in 1890 New Orleans was that an antique mirror sitting undisturbed in a shuttered room for decades could accumulate the same risk as a factory floor. The deterioration process continues regardless of whether anyone is present. A sealed room concentrates rather than disperses the vapor. The longer the mirror sits undisturbed, the more compromised the backing becomes. And the more compromised the backing, the more acute the exposure when someone finally enters the room and begins to work close to the glass. Particularly a very old one. Particularly one with significant deterioration in its backing. Particularly one that someone had, once upon a time, taken the trouble to cover carefully and leave covered. Consider who covered it and when. The mirror appears in the household inventory of the family who owned the Royal Street townhouse, and tracing that family backward through the Louisiana notarial records held in the Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge takes you to Saint-Domingue. The family arrived in New Orleans in 1804. Among the wave of refugees who fled the newly declared Republic of Haiti following the revolution that ended French colonial rule there. They brought what they could carry or ship. And among the objects documented in a partial inventory prepared for customs clearance in 1805 is one pier glass in gilded frame. French manufacture, approximately 1765. Condition noted as fair. A pier glass is a large mirror, typically hung between windows. A French manufacture pier glass from 1765 with a deteriorating mercury amalgam backing arriving in New Orleans in 1805. The family kept it for 15 years. And then someone covered it, deliberately, carefully, with canvas secured at the hooks. There is no written record of that decision. There is only the cloth and the cord and the fact that the covering was still in place when Adele found it 70 years later. This is the part I keep returning to. Because someone in that family knew by approximately 1820 that the mirror was dangerous. Not from toxicological literature, that knowledge was not in general circulation in New Orleans in 1820. More likely from experience. From a previous incident, an illness that a careful observer connected to the mirror and the mirror's condition. From a physician in the French colonial tradition who had read enough to recognize what he was seeing. From the community of enslaved people and free people of color who worked in the household and who held, collectively, the knowledge that the Vodou tradition encoded as prohibition. We cannot know which of these. We know only the consequence. Someone covered the mirror. They kept it. It was valuable. A 4-foot French pier glass in a gilded frame was a significant piece of property, and Saint-Domingue refugee families who had lost most of their material wealth in the Revolution held tightly to what remained. They kept it covered. And the covering became household rule, maintained across 3 generations as the original knowledge of why the rule existed presumably faded, until the rule itself faded when the household changed hands and an 11-month employee was given the upstairs rooms to clear. The Vodou community of New Orleans and I mean this in the precise historical sense. The tradition that had developed among the enslaved and free African American and Creole communities of the city across the 18th and 19th centuries maintained, as one of its consistent practical teachings, a specific prohibition regarding certain old mirrors. Not all mirrors. Old ones. Particularly old ones in houses that had come from the Caribbean. The teaching was, do not uncover them. Do not clean them. Do not let anyone handle a damaged one. When an old mirror in a wealthy household needed to be moved, there were specific people in the community who understood what precautions to observe and who had learned those precautions from the people before them. The knowledge was structured. It was not vague unease about reflections. It was a specific, transmitted practical protocol for a specific category of dangerous object. This appears in the notebooks of Lafcadio Hearn, who spent a decade in New Orleans in the 1870s and 1880s, documenting the city's Creole culture, and who recorded, in a notebook held in the Hearn collection at the Howard Tilton Memorial Library at Tulane, that multiple informants in the Trem neighborhood described specific old mirrors as poisoned glass and explained the prohibition not in terms of spirits or curses but in terms of illness, that cleaning or handling such mirrors made people sick, that this was known, that the knowledge was old. Hearn noted this without knowing what to do with it. He recorded it as superstition, which was the only category his framework offered him. He was recording practical chemistry transmitted through oral tradition in the only form that tradition had been permitted to take. And there is the letter. In the collection of the Louisiana State Museum, in a file of miscellaneous 19th century correspondence acquired with a lot from a Royal Street estate in 1951, there is a letter from the family solicitor to the head of the household, dated 8 days after Adele's death. The letter is 2 pages. The first page concerns the disposition of property in Thibodaux Parish. The second page concerns Adele. The solicitor wrote, in French, that the matter of the girl's illness should be attributed in all records to natural causes, as any connection drawn to the glass would raise questions about the glass itself that we cannot afford to answer. Questions about the glass itself that we cannot afford to answer. He then directed that the glass be returned to its covered state immediately and is not to be moved or handled by any person employed in the household under any instruction whatsoever, until such time as its proper disposition can be arranged through appropriate channels. Those channels were never arranged. The family held the townhouse until 1919. The estate was broken up in 1923, and in the 1923 estate sale inventory, the mirror appears as antique French pier glass, pre-revolutionary, backing compromised, handle with extreme care. Handle with extreme care. Written in 1923, the knowledge of the danger had moved through that family for over a century, from the person who first covered the mirror to the successive generations who maintained the covering without always knowing why, to the estate manager who wrote that cautionary line in a sale inventory as if it were simply a descriptor of condition. The full history behind those 6 words had long gone unspoken to anyone outside the family, and by 1923 it is probable that no member of the family could have told you exactly why the caution existed. What Adele's death represents is not an isolated incident in the history of New Orleans' old houses. It is unusually well documented because of the physician's private journal. The deteriorating mercury backing of colonial-era mirrors produced a distinctive cluster of symptoms that a careful physician could recognize, and New Orleans in the 1880s and 1890s had careful physicians, some of whom recorded privately what they chose not to record publicly. The Tulane Special Collections holds 3 other physicians' journals from the period between 1870 and 1910 containing notations about patients with presentations similar to Adele's, all in households with documented colonial-era furnishings, all with death certificates listing fever or congestion or some other nonspecific cause. All noted privately by the attending physician as consistent with heavy metal exposure. 3 other cases. Same decade, same class of household. None connected to each other in any published medical or historical literature, because connecting them required reading across 4 private journals donated to the archive by different families at different times between 1930 and 1962. And knowing, before you began, what you were looking for. The pattern is not the mirrors. It is the silence around the mirrors. The objects themselves were eventually documented at estate sales, in insurance inventories, in the occasional notation of an art dealer who knew enough to flag the condition of a deteriorated backing. The connection between the mirrors and the deaths was never documented publicly, because documentation would have raised questions about liability and provenance, and the nature of the objects that nobody with a financial interest in the estates wanted answered. And so it stayed in the private journals, and in the oral tradition of the community that had always known to call them poison glass, and in a solicitor's 2-page letter that sat in a miscellaneous correspondence file in a museum archive for 70 years before anyone read past the first page. This was not unique to New Orleans, though New Orleans held more colonial-era mercury mirrors in active household use than almost anywhere else in North America, because the Saint-Domingue refugees had brought an entire generation of French colonial furnishings into the city in the first decade of the 1800s, and that material concentrated in the old houses and was rarely sold outward. The same class of object produced documented deaths among household workers in Charleston in the 1870s. Deaths recorded in physicians' private journals as neurotoxic in character and attributed publicly to fever. In Natchez, a newspaper notice from 1884 described the death of a household employee with symptoms a modern toxicologist would recognize without difficulty, attributed in print to a sudden and unaccountable illness. In Savannah, the records of a freedmen's hospital in the same decade include admissions with tremor, salivation, and respiratory distress that the attending physicians noted privately as consistent with heavy metal exposure. Consistent, but never attributed, because attribution would have required naming the households and confronting who bore responsibility for the danger those households contained. The geography of the deaths follows the geography of the refugee migration. Saint-Domingue furnishings moving north along the Gulf Coast, concentrated in the homes of the planter class, tended to by workers who were never told what the objects in those homes could do. And it follows the geography of silence. The communities that knew the danger were the same communities that bore the deaths. The communities that bore the deaths were the same communities whose knowledge of the danger was categorized as folklore. What the Vodou tradition preserved, encoded as a prohibition against cleaning or uncovering old mirrors, was not superstition. It was epidemiology, the accumulated observational knowledge of a community that had watched people become ill after handling certain objects, recognized the pattern across generations, and transmitted the pattern as a rule, in the only form available to a community whose practical knowledge was not being written into the medical literature of the period. The prohibition was correct. The chemistry behind it would not be formally described in American medical publications for decades. And when the knowledge was finally written down in Hearn's notebooks, in the physician's private journals, it was written as curiosity or as private professional notation, never as the acknowledgement that a community had correctly understood a danger the formal medical establishment had not yet named. Adele cleaned the mirror for a morning, because no one told her not to. She had no way of knowing that the canvas cover she removed was not incidental housekeeping, but a 70-year-old protocol. She had no way of knowing that the silver-gray crystals at the mirror's edges were deteriorated mercury amalgam that she was agitating into vapor with each pass of the damp cloth. She had no access to Hearn's notebooks or to the Gazette Médicale de Paris or to the internal knowledge of the Trem community about what certain old objects could do. The family who owned the mirror knew not to touch it. The solicitor's letter makes that plain. The knowledge had been in the household for at least 70 years before her arrival. What was not maintained was the communication of that rule to the people employed to do the cleaning. The knowledge stopped at the family line. It did not cross to the servants' understanding of what they were being asked to handle. And that gap between the knowledge held by the people who owned the dangerous thing and the ignorance of the people asked to manage it is where Adele died. Not in a haunted room, not at the hands of a curse, in a gap that the household had maintained, the solicitor had sealed, the death certificate had papered over, and the archive had preserved in a miscellaneous correspondence file that required knowing to look for the second page. If this is something you find yourself needing to share it with someone who still thinks the old prohibitions were only superstition. Because sometimes the prohibition is the science. The people who were not permitted to write the science formally found another way to transmit what they knew. What they transmitted was accurate. And people died anyway, because the people with the power to protect them chose, in writing, not to.